So last night I got on a plane after spending a day leading a conference just like this where I live in Minneapolis. It's called Agile Day Twin Cities. And one of the things that rarely happens as this dude tries to run away is that the people that organize the conference rarely say, hey, now how about a big hand for me? So how about a big hand for these guys, even though it's prematurely, for the people who put this on? We did an interview this morning and someone asked me about why I wanted to be here, and I gave a pretty honest and straight answer, which is I like smaller conferences like this. I think when conferences grow really large, it's hard to have the conversations that need to be had. And the best conversations usually happen when you walk out the door, in the hallways. You walk out of a session, you're like, I don't believe that. That doesn't work at my company. Or you're like, wow, that's interesting. I'm not sure why we never tried that. You know, and so I like smaller conferences because I think that this is a place where those conversations can happen. You could talk to a lot of the people in this situation. Hopefully, I went to a couple of sessions and the speakers were really approachable. I mean, if you have questions for me, you can ask whatever you want. I got a lot of happy Agile stories. I got a lot of bad Agile stories. And the people that don't have these are liars, right? They're charlatans. Because if you ask people to work in a collaborative manner, to be very honest, to be forthright about what the challenges are, to speak openly about the things that are wrong, and figure out how to learn from them, and you're in an ecosystem where people are very scared, there's not the ability to learn, they're pressured without any context, then this stuff fails appropriately. You know, Ron Jeffries was fond of saying, for people that say, we tried Agile and it didn't work, Ron would say, that's like saying, I tried baseball, it didn't work. Doesn't I always say, if you strum a saxophone, it's not the saxophone's fault. So, they asked me kind of other questions this morning. Oh, I remember someone said, did you answer the questions right? And I was like, I don't know, this is not a world of kind of right and wrong in this Agile stuff. I said, I answered them honestly, and I answered them based on my experience, because just because I'm passionate about something doesn't mean it's right. What I'm going to do is walk through and tell you some of the things I see, some of the things I experience. I work in a lot of countries, a lot of cultures, a lot of companies, a lot of domains. I might work with a group of people that are building firmware for a medical device, or I might work with a group that's doing a very small, isolated iPhone app. This group might be 300 people across 3 continents. This might be 3 people in one room. You got to figure out how to apply the right process to help people produce things and learn, not just the process that is in a book somewhere. So I thought, as a vehicle, we could play with physics a little bit. So does anybody know what this is a picture of? What's that? Yeah, and where? Right, it's Star City. So I was coaching in Russia one time, and one of the guys I was working with was actually a rocket scientist. He couldn't find a job as a rocket scientist, so he was building websites, which is a little sad, right? But so we went to the Russian Space Museum, because I'm a child of the 60s and the 70s, so I was really influenced by the space program. And one of the things that was amazing is the tracks, the way the Russians kind of got the missile or the rocket out to the launch pad is they just drove it out and then they dropped the bottom and they let gravity just stand it up. As opposed to, at the risk of getting myself in trouble with my countrymen, at the States, it was this giant machine that was really well designed and it took forever to get out to the launch pad. And what's interesting about this style is this is exactly how the Egyptians raised things. They just dug out a hole underneath and whatever they wanted to build stood up. Gravity did the work, and I thought, that's a sweet metaphor to kind of riff on. Now, you should know that the last time I did this talk, or a time I did this talk, it was at Intel, and this guy, Don Reinerson, spoke before me, and Dave Snowden spoke after me, and like one guy has a long physics degree, and the other guy has like an engineering degree, and I'm a musician, so this is going to be sort of like musical physics. So if there's some things that are a little bit wrong, kind of roll with it. So I was kind of thinking about that, and then shortly thereafter I read these 2 books. And I don't know if you've read either one of these books, but I think they're both really good. I think the book on the left is exceptional. The book on the left is published, the woman Jessica works for Y Combinator. So it's like a really interesting organization that's produced a lot of really powerful product companies. And she went and interviewed people that started these companies. But if you look at the names that are up there on the titles, they're not really startups anymore, but they were at one time. At one time, they were a small group of people saying, hey, I got a cool idea, let's build this idea. One of the best stories in the book about Apple is about Steve Wozniak. And so apparently, when the two of them met, Steve Wozniak was working at HP, and he's got his job kind of building calculators, and he's like, I don't ever have to do anything again, man. I'm making calculators. You know, how cool is my job? And so he was playing with chips. He couldn't afford to buy chips, so he was doing circuit design very much like in a test-driven manner. He was just sketching out what he wanted to happen, and he ran out of chips, and that's how he accidentally put color into the Apple II. It was like, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, and with a little accident thrown in. And Jobs was bright enough to recognize what it was, but Woz talks a lot about kind of the programming and the engineering aspect of Apple, and that often gets overlooked in, like, you know, let's praise Steve Jobs dialogue. I don't know if you guys know much about Steve Wozniak. He and in Apple's hierarchy, Steve Wozniak is still listed as programmer. That's the highest paid programmer in the world, right? But that's dude's job, and he kind of effectively said, I'm really good at this. I think I would be bad at leading people. Let me do what I do really well. And that's kind of what doesn't happen when small companies go from this side to this side. So this book written by Geoffrey Moore, he's the guy who wrote the book Crossing the Chasm. People in the Agile community talk about it all the time. This book is basically why great ideas die in large organizations. People getting stuck to their roles is one thing, just as an example. But I think it's really neat because I meet a lot of people that work at big companies where good things are happening that never get out into orbit. They never escape the gravity of the planet. They don't make it past escape velocity. So I started thinking about that, and I thought, well, why is that? And I drew this really simple, kind of dumb picture for myself, because I'm always trying to kind of come up with a visualization or a metaphor to explain things that feel inherently correct that I can't communicate to other people. And so I think, like, on this dimension is use. And on this dimension is, like, you know, context. And on this dimension is uncertainty. Products, people, use, uncertainty. And on this dimension is process down here. And architecture and roles and technology and all sorts of stuff that you need to produce things. And I started thinking, that's kind of cool to me. That's not a bad way to think about it, because the little tiny companies I work with, 3 to 5 people, they totally live on this dimension. It's all about, will this thing sell? Will I have a job tomorrow? Our idea is really great. And I go into larger companies. Here's a really good example. You go into a small company, you say, what do you do? They'll usually say, I'm building blah. They'll tell you about their product. Go into a larger organization, you say to some programmer, what do you do? The person will say, I'm a Java guy. It's a radical difference between these two. This person's bonded to the programming language. This person's bonded to their product. That's about as interesting as saying, I'm Dave, I speak English. That doesn't really tell you much about me, you know, what I'm trying to accomplish. And I thought, like, people end up accidentally letting these things down here weigh them down. And so I'm going to sort of make an argument like this is the dimension that I think is kind of the 2010s. If the 90s were the land of, like, project, the decade of projects, and 2000s were sort of the land of process, I think the next decade is the land of product learning. It doesn't mean engineering, things that were practiced as an extreme programming example, go away. They just kind of sort of become, if you're in a band, you're expected to play your instrument, but the whole point of being in a band is to perform as a group. If you show up and you can't tune your instrument, the other musicians look at you like, dude, what is up? If you're a guitar player, what you do is you look back at the bass player like, dude, what are you doing? Guitar players are dangerous. I'm a guitar player, unfortunately. So I started thinking about this as structural complexity, and then someone in a session today referenced the person I took this term from, accidental complexity. So that's a Fred Brooks term, the guy that wrote the Mythical Man Month. Best joke I've heard in about 2 years is a bunch of programmers bought their managers 9 copies of the Mythical Man Month, and they said, now you can read the book 9 times as fast. That was sweet, man. I wish I would have been one of those people. And I thought, that's really good. And then I was at Intel, coaching staff at Intel, I think, is one of the best I've met. They're very aware of the people they have at Intel. They know that they have people that are circuit designers that don't do anything with code. They have double E's that are embedded engineers. Over here, they have a marketing group, and there's a big chasm between those two. So how do you shift these people that do things really well and help them say, that circuit no longer is meaningful unto itself. It has to exist in context of a product. Because Intel's been a chip manufacturer that's kind of figuring out, boy, those chips have to go into products, and that's kind of a more ambiguous space than a circuit, which is like a closed universe. And he said, you're talking about incidental complexity. And I love that expression, because it happens like one little bad assumption at a time. One small, fearful team that's like, baseball didn't work for us. People not really looking at the evidence, maybe people scorecarding how they're doing based on language of process instead of outcomes and evidence. And I thought, okay, well, let's explore that. So like I said, I think a small company lives in this dimension, 3 to 6 people. A largish program. And it's interesting to me, you go from like 13 to 30, and things change radically. Somewhere between like 13 and 30 or 40, there's oftentimes like the management group moves up to a higher level in the office, or a different place, and you go from kind of all sitting together, which is like, my first company, we did a lot of things now called Agile. Like we did a lot of pair programming, but we called it working together. Because we sat in a wide open space, and there was this really brilliant dude named Paul at the company. Wrote a device driver for a machine that was printing checks that was lighting checks on fire. 2 bugs into production without ever seeing the machine, without ever touching the machine. He took his design and went through every single state transition and validated that they would all work. How is that not test-driven without the tests? And every time I walked over to Paul's desk, I knew when I walked over, if I said, hey man, I got a problem, will you look at my code? That he would never look at my code. It was always, what have you done? What have you learned? What are your questions? So after 15 times of walking over to his desk and looking kind of stupid, I started solving my problems on the way to Paul's desk, kind of like a test driven. Well, he's going to ask me this and this and this. Yeah, I don't know that. And I walk back. And when these companies grow up, you split, and the splits happen. So one of the words that's just so prominent in the Agile world right now that's really starting to eat at me is everybody wants to do scaled Agile. And a lot of people that say scale mean spread. They want more people at their company to be successful the way they were maybe. They had a really good experience. So I'm going to try and ask that you guys separate those two. Don't conflate the concepts and say scale is a large number of people trying to build one thing. 2 days ago, I spent a lot of time with Target. And Target has a lot of refactoring opportunities right now. Obviously, saying that here is super appropriate, yeah. And what's interesting is that a lot of the big retailers, they don't think of their .com presence as a thing. They think of it as a bunch of systems. And then and this is not unique to just Target, especially since you're recording this, but they inappropriately, they just accidentally start slapping Agile words on things. So they form a team, and they put someone on the team to write the stories, and they call that person a product owner, and the person doesn't own any product. It's an arbitrary title that it's like, that's what we're supposed to do, because that's how you do Scrum. It's like sitting in planning meetings with people, and they're using planning poker. And they're having an argument about whether it's a 5 or an 8. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, how long can I listen to this? And after about 5 minutes, 6 minutes, I say, what if we call it a 7? And some dude goes, we don't have a 7 card. I'm like, all done, man. I can't really go there with you anymore. What's going to happen if we're in a fire, dude? We got to be able to think critically. And so like these larger groups, some of that weight happens. And then you have the real complexity. Does anybody in here work on medical devices? Are they embedded medical devices? Implantable? So, if you work on a medical device, so like I cut my teeth working on code that did testing for programmers that talk to pacemakers inside people. And so at one point, they made us go to Dog Lab. I don't know if it was just to scare us. If it was, it worked really well on me. because they flipped on some code that you were going to do inside an animal that was being tested. And if you care about humanity and creatures and things, what happens is every test you didn't write just goes flying past your eyes like a horrible high-speed film. And then suddenly, like in that ecosystem, you stop lying about testing. And when you stop lying about testing, automation isn't an idea, it's a solution. Because you got to do the testing. Now, maybe some of you guys are in the situation, I wrote a lot of C++ in the 90s, and it was sort of a social norm with your friends and neighbors in the 90s to lie to each other about certain things. So like, did you write a test for that? Yeah, dude, I wrote a test for that. You know, we looked right at each other and we lied about it. You can't lie about it when you're working on a medical device. In most countries, there's a governance group that says, you have to show us that this is going to be safe before you put it inside a living creature, like a human. And that's an evidence-based discussion. There's some bureaucracy involved with it, but when testing isn't an option, automation is your solution. So most of the groups where I work on really complex engineering problems that are mission critical, they have reams of automation, not because it's agile, because it's what they need to do to survive. They have to do that testing. That's harder to sell to a bank. It's harder to sell to an insurance company. That could be a really good discussion. And then there's the ultimate weight of enterprise blah, blah, blah. So the first time I heard enterprise, I was like, I was hoping, first of all, we were talking about Star Trek, being a nerd. And then it was like this word that started getting prepended to everything. And all I could think of was like Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride, like, you keep saying that word. Right? So first time I started hearing enterprise agile and enterprise scrum, I was like, military intelligence, right? This doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And I started saying, what are people looking for? They're looking to spread this idea. When it goes wrong, though, they say, this is a classic like PMO mistake. If everyone behaves the same way, then we'll get the same results from every group. That's the latent myth that isn't spoken out loud, and consistent behavior doesn't drive outcomes across varied products that you're trying to build. You got to figure out the ecosystem you're working inside of. So I thought we'd go through, and as a joke, quickly go through like 4 lessons. I had a physics teacher that I really liked. And he would always say, so assume acceleration is a constant. And behind that was, because if you think about that with all this other stuff I'm going to tell you about, your head's going to explode. And I always thought that was pretty cool, because I think in some ecosystems, delivery has become more known. It's closer to a constant. And now those people that are really good at delivering within and across teams are starting to ask a much more ambiguous question, like, are we delivering the right thing? Do we know much about the people we're delivering it for? That's a more difficult question. So first lesson in gravity is mass has consequence. I did this talk. Right away, a British physicist came up to me and said, you don't mean mass, you mean weight. And I was like, dude, go lay by your dish. Settle down. Take your PhD, and remember I'm a musician, okay? So the middle book is called The Importance of Being Lean. So this is my favorite thing that keeps happening year after year. Someone hands me a 400-page book on lean. How is that not funny? Right? I mean, when you're a musician, most of the time you don't have any money, you don't eat a lot, you live in kind of horrible conditions, so you make fun of each other. That's just kind of what you do to kind of survive. And like when someone hands me a 400-page book on lean, it's really hard not to make fun of them. Especially when one of the chapters is write less code. I'm like, wow, I didn't think of that. Write less code, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. It's just a prescription. Write less code. Right? The hard part is when you're scared. You go to what you know. If what you know is coding, then you maybe don't have the courage to say, now is the time to stop coding. I got to be in a conference with Kent Beck last year. Someone said, question I hear all the time, how much testing is enough? And Kent, the sage that he is, said, I write tests until I'm not scared anymore. It wasn't 68% coverage. And it's an outcome-based model. It's like, when I'm scared, I write the wrong stuff. So some of the mass we accumulate is in process, technology, all sorts of stuff. So if we look at the first one, there's process mass. The Agile movement started, and do you know what the word was before it was called Agile? Does anybody know what it was called? What's that? Lightweight. A 400-page book on lean fails that test. That's a failed test. So lightweight was interesting, And it was about doing small things and kind of replacing documentation with collaboration. And so then people tried with Scrum, and there was sometimes a reaction where people went to Kanban. Other people kind of said, boy, when we're good at learning in cycles, the cycles aren't sacred anymore. And really what happens is the flow across cycles. That was kind of the smart move to Kanban. But I had all these people running around, and all I could think of was this commercial I used to see as a kid all the time, like, you got your Scrum in my Kanban. And I was so tired of that discussion. So at the risk of being dangerous, I started my own process. It's called Nonbond. So I asked one of my friends in Mumbai, I said, would you ever serve a meal of only naan bread to your guests? And he said no. And I said, would you ever serve a meal without naan bread? And he said, no, probably not. And I thought, there it is, right? Process is a small part of the meal. It's not supposed to be the point. And so I'm not saying you shouldn't do Scrum, you shouldn't do XP, you shouldn't do Kanban. I'm saying you should measure the least amount of process with the most real and measurable value. 4 people that really know their technology, that have a shared idea of what they're building and really good skills will succeed no matter what you do. 40 people that are sort of struggling, they don't know what they're doing, they're struggling with their technology, they have a lot of debt, they're gonna need a little bit more process. How much is the hard part? So I think I would just throw that out as a goofy idea. You can't go to nonbond.org because it's the lightest process ever. There isn't even a website. No infographics. So the other one I want to throw out for you guys is this idea I stole from a guy named Nassim Taleb, an author. Nassim Taleb talks about epistemic arrogance. Philosophically, the difference between what you know and what you think you know. So just let that one soak in for just a second, because we've all been victim, like yesterday. And I think this idea of product arrogance is not a bad little joke for us to start playing with. The difference between what you need, what you think people need, and what they really need. Like, how well do you measure that? How often do you measure that? How do you even validate that? I'll meet people in an insurance company. They'll say, I never see anyone that uses our product. And I'll say to them, well, do the people that see them, do they have these little video recording devices in their pocket? Could you make a little movie? And I have more people at large organizations making recordings of user experiences and throwing out play school retrospectives where they're not talking about how well they're doing producing a valuable product and watching little video clips of people using their product. Like, that's when it's done. It's done when someone uses it. Smaller organizations have that benefit. You can go sit with people. If you have a small organization, you may be able to fire up the analytics to say, yeah, they're doing what we want. We've been building a product at DevJam called Cardboard. So our joke is if Google Docs and Post-it notes had a kid, it would look like cardboard. It's for people trying to do distributed design. What we think we're selling people is a collaborative experience that's like people playing with cards or index cards or Post-it notes. So our leading indicators is we'll put changes in to say, we think if people can collaborate more, we're going to sell more. The lagging indicator is sales. And so we put the leading indicator out there and we look at the analytics, and then there's usually like a 3-4 week lag, and we look at the data across those two and say, does our hypothesis validated by our sales? And that's a very different way of thinking about things that goes way beyond how much stuff did you get done in sprint X. If you don't get stuff done in sprint X, it's really hard to validate your hypothesis. But it's an interesting leading and lagging indicator. So I'm sure, hopefully no one in here worked on this product. But you can imagine people going, look at how cool it is. Man, just look at it. I mean, sales did not follow that up. Whereas I think, I don't know if you guys know this, an interesting part of this product. Does anybody know how they picked the form factor for the first iPhone? The people that were the testers walked around with a block of wood in their pocket. When their other phone rang, they reached into their pocket and pulled out a block of wood and said, hello? That's how they did the design for the form factor. It was very much like deep experience testing. And there's a lot more of these, like the word requirements. Kent's joke about requirements that I've heard in some form, usually from this other guy up here, Jeff Patton, is it's been one of the most damning words in software development. I think it propagates a significantly dangerous amount of certainty. It's required. Doesn't sound very optional. Doesn't sound like something that's going to start a conversation, whereas when the XPers came up with stories, it was like, tell me a story. That's the beginning of a discussion as opposed to, and it's really neat to me because it sits in that realm of certain versus uncertain. Another one was this, like another mass you guys carry around, especially in medium to large organizations, is the cost of meetings. So I would say you could leave here with one of my wacky ideas is test-driven meeting. You walk in and you say, what are we trying to solve? What do we want to know? If no one can tell you, you leave. Just like you don't write code. Apparently, Jobs used to do that. You want to read a really good book about Agile that's not Agile, you read Insanely Simple, The Obsession That Drives Apple Computing. Jobs would walk into a room and say, okay, what's this meeting about? Why are you here? Why are you here? Why are you here? Why are you here? Okay, respectfully, I'm going to ask you and you to leave. So I'm sure he was kind of a jerk to some people, but that would be a way to cut down on just the proliferation of people in meetings. Like what people sometimes forget is that stand-up meetings were supposed to be meeting killers, not just another bad status meeting that you go to. A lot of stand-ups I go to, someone says, yesterday I was in meetings all day, today I'm in meetings all day, no blockers. Yeah. Glad you said that, man. Can I have my 4 seconds back? Yeah. Someone says that to me if I'm in the meeting, I would say, well, what were the meetings about? What are the struggles? You don't sound very happy. As I'm trying to, as a coach, start the conversations that we need to have. So I put a $ in here because a small group that got bought by another giant company that we work with on the west coast of the States, we came out of a meeting and someone who was in the meeting published the cost of the meeting. So I don't know if that feels sort of like a Nietzschean love model or something like that, right? But you came out, you multiply it times the people in the meeting, you say, was that a $7,000 meeting? You know, and by the way, we burned $1,000 while we waited for everyone to show up. You know, it just makes it very real. It's like an evidence-based model. And there's more of these things like, yeah, we got to use this technology. We got to use this technology or this whatever, you know, the bright, shiny object. And I kind of wanted to put this picture in here. I don't know if has anybody ever seen this? This is 800 Days of Minecraft in 8 minutes. So just to reflect for a second, 2 people sold their product to Microsoft for $2.6 billion. Is that worth repeating? It was 2 people, right? So this is the code base. Just if you're curious about this, I put this in because I went to Eric's talk on strategic testing, and he got me kind of going. This is a product Google built called Gorse. And so inside Gorse, there's a bunch of different controls. You can point it, you just point it at your source control system. You point it at like Subversion. The first one I saw was for Rails, and you can see on the top there, it's just playing. Those are days kind of going by, and so it shows things that you would kind of are blind to. You don't have visibility into the accidental complexity that's growing in your code. And you can make the nodes glow in different ways, and you can see which crackpot commits a whole bunch of garbage Friday morning before the end of the sprint, so you can say his stuff is done. You know, I mean, just if you see that stuff with a tool like Sonar, because it shows you a bloom of like complexity that's kind of growing. But this kind of shows like, well, who's doing this? So imagine, I mean, you guys could take this, point it at your source control system for the last 2 weeks, pump out a movie and watch it as a group during a retrospective. Let's see, I sort of feel like we don't need more process, man. We got Nonbond. We're all done. We've synthesized it down to its essence. We need a lot of visualizations. We need to figure out how to spark the conversations about what we don't know about product. And so I'm going to ask you guys to take a few minutes of the time I have left. I'm just going to give you like 2-3 minutes. Turn to the person next to you and start talking about what is the mass that you've collected that you could jettison from your vehicle to reach escape velocity. Okay, so 2 minutes of chaos starts right now. Go. So I'm going to argue that that's what collaboration sounds like. Right? You know, it's like you walk into a stand-up and it's quiet, you're the coach, you don't need a lot of science, things are bad. People should be talking about things, even the things that are wrong. So if anybody wants to talk about like accidental mass they brought onto their ship after the talk, I got nowhere to go, right? I'm here all night, so I'll hang out with everyone. I was kind of telling the organizers at the end of the day at DevJam, we have what we call a beer-rospective. Yeah, so we could have one of those if you guys wanted to. The next lesson is gravity sucks. And I put this woman up here because I saw her speak. The university that's south of my city pairs with the Nobel Foundation. They bring in Nobel laureates. And in 2005, they brought in all these Nobel laureates to talk about the 100th anniversary of Einstein's publications. And this woman is absolutely brilliant. So she just gave this amazing talk. At the end, one of the other physicists said, "How do you know how the universe started? You weren't there." So she started doing fundamental science. She walked through hypothesis, test, conclusion, hypothesis, test, conclusion. At one point she paused and she said, "I think we should all remember that gravity is a theory. It's a pretty well-tested theory, so if you jump off the building, the results are known." What if we said, Scrum is a theory? Scrum started out, Ken Schwaber used to stand in front of people and say, it's just a framework. The people that are out there shucking safe right now are saying it's just a framework. Already, though, in many instances where I see people using safe, what's happening is there's more process, there's more meetings, there's more people that are further disconnected from the passion of producing things in the name of scale. Somehow that feels like the framework's gone wrong. And after a while, you can't blame all the people. Well, they just didn't know how to use it. At some point, you might have to say, maybe the system is inherently messed up. It has to evolve. It has to change. So mass that happens in large organizations, medium organizations, there's some companies that are definitely like Jupiter. And then there's other companies that are like, a black hole or a little white, a dwarf or something. They have 8 people and they have the mass of Jupiter. Because oftentimes, they're filled up with this mythical certainty. They're wrapped around the axle of, I know we know what to do. And then they use Agile methods and build the wrong thing faster and celebrate it. Right? And you can have all sorts of continuous integration and automated tests. It's really hard to automate some learning. I'm a big fan of automate everything you can that you can learn from, like cyclomatic complexity, like build and deploy costs, like chef and scratching environments and bringing them back up, like testing and things like that. But there's certain things you can't automate and measure. Like you can't automate and measure love. It doesn't work that way. Friendship, happiness. My mom is 74. Things she loves in her life are her Honda Accord and Angry Birds. She always says to me, I love Angry Birds. Helps me with my hand-eye coordination, David. I'm like, tell yourself whatever you need to, Mom, right? And she loves Angry Birds. Only game she's ever played. I think it's because they made physics tangible for my mom. She can interact with it. She doesn't know how to necessarily express that, but there's a certain pride where she's solving the problems. It's not fun. It's fulfilling for her. And so this is a classic gravity well at companies. And if you want to look at it kind of in this crazy picture I drew, it has lots of versions. One version looks like this. This is a classic challenge I see. The developers are down here, testers are here, and the analysts are here. So, obviously the Agile model that people started doing is saying, well, we should build teams that are like this. They have lots of names, Scrum teams, feature teams, whatever, and that's definitely the way to go. It's just that's an easy case. The thing that I think made this difficult a lot of times was that the way the structures were set up. A simple example would be these people all report to some manager. These people report to some manager. These people report to some manager. Yesterday, I took a look again at the origin of the word manager. Does anybody know the etymology of manager? The Latin term, yes, that's correct. Who said that? Yes, you know everything, dude. Stephen Hawking's in disguise in the front row. Yeah, yeah, it is. It's the Latin term for leading a horse around by the hand, manus. That's a tragic metaphor, man, that we draw on. And it's interesting, at an organization like I would go into these engineering shops, and kind of like when they promote people through the ranks, they become team leads. That's a very simple line. I like team lead more than manager, scrum master. I don't mind coach because it at least connotates something. My favorite role that I think is significant is this idea of a producer. So in my little sphere at DevJam, we have teams of 4 product developers led by a producer, and those are all only titles we have. And I named all those titles because I get to control that little universe, because I want everybody to have a connotation of like, it's what we're producing. It's what we're producing. Obviously, we have to have the skills to produce it, but like, if you guys go see a crappy band, you don't go, well, I bet they practice really well. Like, you don't really care about that. You care about the performance. So that's a simpler example where this comes into place. And then there's this idea of gravity at scale. So let's redefine scale simply as many people doing one thing. So that used to be scaled, or we used to do this stuff like where we would have, tragically back end, front end, or this would be middle tier, front end. Because that gave people a separation, and maybe these people used the technology that these people didn't. But one of the things I've been telling some of the retailers I've been working with, and to use my sweet mother as a reference again, is like, she doesn't really care about your code or your teams or your structures or your services. She just wants to buy stuff on your site. And my mom doesn't know how Amazon works, but she trusts Amazon the same way she trusts her Honda. She doesn't trust a lot of other experiences like that because she has a few weird experiences, and it doesn't matter what their burn down charts look like. It really doesn't matter about that engineering stuff. I guess it matters in the sense that she can't actually do it, she can't experience it, but in the end, you need to, I would argue, my experience is when you pivot on this dimension, this is where the ambiguity is. What does my mom want to do? What does my little daughter want to do? What does your daughter or mother want to do? How does that change from now to 6 months later? How does it change when a new OS comes out on a new device and she bails on Apple and runs to something so much cooler 6 months from now? If you're lined up on this level, you're stuck with that structure, and what happens is companies freak out because this is ambiguous and they drop down to this level. If you're at a smaller company, you're fortunate because it's easier to shed gravity. Another one would be, like, how do you actually do this? So I wanted to draw just a quick, goofy picture. Like, what we do with multiple teams planning is we'll get a group of people together for, let's just say, an iteration, and we'll say, for like 60 minutes on a Monday, what are the goals? I should switch to a different color because that's probably really difficult to read. We'll say, what are the goals for across the teams? So that would be the same people, if you do it right, that would be in what people call a scrum of scrums. So align that up with multiple teams delivering. And I just drew like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 teams, but let's be clear, humans don't scale linear. Twins are more than twice as hard. It's the same kind of thing in this situation when you're trying to get multiple groups to produce something together. The way you break down the dimensions of the groups has to be kind of primarily organized around what you're trying to produce. So we'll take these groups and we'll say, up here we might have some cross-cutting players, like someone that's trying to do product-driven architecture, like someone that's a product manager, like someone that's thinking about all the cross-cutting things, security, concurrency, localization, stuff that doesn't neatly fit into one story and one team in one sprint because we're talking about scaling across multiple groups. And then inside this window, I don't really care if they do Scrum or Kanban or Nonbond. But I know that in order for us to produce a process, we need to say, oh my God, what if this is the services team that's a producer to two different consumers, like a web consumer and a mobile consumer? If that services group is the one that's most full up in that cycle that we're trying to deliver for, I want to get that same group back together and talk about the dependencies and the constraints of delivering across teams. And so SAFe sort of does some of this stuff, but my problem with it is it's multiplying delivery. There's this deep myth of like getting more stuff means more value. And discretely on a single team, that myth lives in the context of more points equals more value. That's only true if a point is actually a measure of size and value, and that's not the case. Most organizations, a point is just a size of effort, and the value's kind of been divorced from it. That's a bit more difficult conversation. So I mentioned the gravity of enterprise, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to skip over that and talk about this, which I think is difficult, which is, as an example, I was talking about a medical device group, and this is true with a bunch of different companies we work with. There's hardware, firmware, and software. And your little like developer, tester, BA is a tiny stack inside a much more difficult problem. So if you're building firmware for a pacemaker, you can't wait for the hardware in order to be competitive with the product, and so the solution is you have to build an emulator that emulates the hardware. It's not free. It is valuable. It's not free. You have to be really disciplined. You need an enormous amount of testing because you basically are running test to test tests. But you can't wait. You can't wait and say, oh, well, I don't know, the hardware people are behind again. It's like game over. Everybody loses in that situation. And what I see, like, in my city is Medtronic, and what Medtronic did brilliantly is they said, well, yeah, let's not start with a full stack that cuts through that because that's going to be so much organizational change. Let's prove it out in the software space. Let's make a case. Let's go tell the rest of these people the best critical thinking we can, what evidence of why we think it's better, not because you should do it, not because it's new, because here's how it helped us. Nothing sells like evidence-based success. Someone asked a question earlier today about getting executives on board. Some executives will listen to an evidence-based case if you line it up with the financial. Other executives and other people in general are goofballs. And no matter what evidence you bring them, if you're having an argument with Sybil, you're going to lose. She's going to switch personalities. It's like as soon as you start arguing with a 3-year-old, you're losing. So if the person you're talking to doesn't understand evidence, and you want to use a process that's collaborative so you can produce evidence to learn, you're in a tough situation. It's a sort of an agile schmagile situation, but I think that more emotion doesn't usually solve the problem. And there's other crazy gravity wells, like this is my favorite one. The people still talk about like Swiss Army knives as a successful metaphor. Has anybody ever sewn with a Swiss Army knife? Have you ever done anything with a Swiss Army knife that has like 50 blades? You always hurt yourself. Like the Swiss Army knife, when they have Swiss Army knife meetings, they all get together and say, dude, I wish I were a Leatherman. That's a geek joke. Some people will laugh later. But I go into organizations and we're said, we got to use this tool. It's the corporate tool. And right away I bristle because there's a whole bunch of tools that just kill conversation. And I think like the best tools you talk about the least. Musicians don't get together and say, dude, we need to have a meeting about B flat. I was like, everybody gets what, if you don't get what B flat is, you're rejected out of the community. That's like a starting point. But I sit with these meetings and we just and waste endless time watching people flip through forms instead of having conversations. So people will say, that's because we're a distributed team. That's not true. Right? You can get people to work in a low fidelity fashion. What worked really well in the early Agile days is we looked at each other. We pushed cards around on tables. And when you look at someone else, it's harder to lie. It's also easier to interpret what they're saying. People of Indian background in the room, you can agree or disagree with this, but like in Minnesota, if someone says something to you and you're not sure about what they say, you say, and has all sorts of meanings. Like could mean, you're a wacko, or that's really fascinating. So I was working in Bangalore for Travelocity one time. Some dude said something in Texas, and 12 people in the room went like this, which I think my experience in India means, It means I heard you. I want you to know I heard you. I don't know yes or no, but that's the stuff that's really difficult. Tools stop that kind of dialogue. In fact, the tool we're building, we're trying to pitch collaboration. That's the biggest problem we're having is like, how do you show people that they're collaborating? And not to be too much of an Apple fanboy, but remember when they put, anybody that owns one of these, and they didn't invent this, but suddenly when you're texting someone, a little ... came up when that person was collaborating with you. You know, oh, they are trying to respond. They are there. That was a $1.98 feature. They were already looking at that data. They knew that someone was trying to connect with you. All they had to do is put a little visualization against it. That's a really good example of like, that's difficult in tools. And then the other ugly gravity well is governments. And you can say Agile and Scrum, and you can scream it, and you can write automation, and like one of the biggest problems that I see in the States is how projects are funded. Something gets funded eventually. I do well with teams. I get a group of people working together. I get a group of teams working together, and at some point I bubble up above some financial or visibility threshold, and then I end up with a meeting like I was in 2 weeks ago of like, let's do the budgeting for 2016. Yeah. Let's talk to Martians at the same time. Those are about as meaningful to me. But if you don't do the budgeting, you don't get the money. You don't get to move forward. You don't get to say no because the people who are asking for those numbers in that situation have to figure out how they're going to reconcile it with the tax code. It's a super ugly discussion. It's sort of depressing when I kind of bump into it sometimes. And I try to do all sorts of different things. Some are covert ops to say, let's get the money, figure out how to take the smallest amount of money and produce something with like real and meaningful and measurable value. That's the best way to start winning that war. And this is one of our challenges, is we gotta stop people talking about budgeting and start people talking about investing. Because by and large, there's this ethos deep inside companies where they treat software like they're buying bonds. In reality, man, we're all a bunch of hedge fund traders. You want to make a series of small mistakes with one big upside. No one says, how are you going to invest your budget? No one talks that way. Budgeting immediately becomes a constraint-based dialogue. End of crazy rant. So I was going to ask you guys to do this. I'll leave it as an exercise for you. But the challenge here is, the first question was, what can you do? The second question is, what can you do that you don't think you can do? What little acts of civil disobedience can you start inside your organization to chip away at the gravity? That's the metaphor starts to fall apart. But staying with our lessons, third lesson is missions matter. Anybody ever seen John Cleese's video called Manfred the Misguided Missile? It was a project management series that's super funny. And it's apparently the story that his mom used to tell him, which is, yeah, this missile takes off and it's sort of confused because it keeps making small corrections as it goes. And John Cleese basically goes through in a very sweet Python-like manner and tells our whole story long before we had a term called Agile in our mouths, which was make measurements towards some goal and adjust as needed to get there, especially if the target moves. So that's what I think the problem is people are still, they line up their sprints and their project assuming they need to go here. They're halfway through the project, and the real value moves out into the audience somewhere. And the real measure of agility is how well you can turn towards where you need to go, not how many practices you're doing. That's an outcome-based kind of view. So people use the term velocity all the time. People that know a little bit about physics know that velocity means speed and direction, vector. My email signature says, if you don't know where you're going, it's easy to iteratively not get there. So I meet a lot of people that are going fast somewhere. And then they get a bunch of people going fast somewhere, like could be towards the edge of the earth, but they're going as fast as they can. So I'm going to ask you guys a weird question, which is, I want you to think of one thing you can do tomorrow that will change real velocity in your world, meaning learning more quickly, validating more that you're going in the right direction. I'll give you like 6 seconds to think of one thing you can do. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Raise your hand if you thought about taking something away. Okay, so that's a really interesting. The origin of this Agile stuff was lightweight, was less processed, yet most people think about adding something when you do that exercise. This guy is all about talking about dynamic ecosystems. This is Nassim Taleb's book about fragile. He would argue that systems that are not fragile, not robust, but anti-fragile, adaptive systems are usually subtractive by nature, either organically or selectively. So that's something you could go back. Your next retrospective, the discussion could be, what's one thing we could stop doing and keep going as fast in a meaningful direction? And the last thing I want to talk about is that meaningful direction. Because missions matter. This is a total nerdy picture. If you go to the Cape in Florida, they went to all the geeks that were involved in launching the Saturn rockets, and they got all their shirts and put them back on the chairs. It's awesome, though. Like, this is the gear. Google published the source code from the LEM when they landed on the moon, and there's comments in it like, this should work. One of the best errors is error 1202. Does anybody know what error 1202 is? Buzz Aldrin, when they were landing, was like, boy, we should get all the data we can to NASA, so he flipped on everything, overloaded the computer. Error 1202, system overload. Error 1203 is reboot. So they're landing on the moon, this computer that's got a tinier footprint than any device in your pocket, saves state, shuts down, and reboots. And so you know how they figured out the problem? They got a bunch of people in a room after the mission and said, what happened? And the guy that wrote the user manual was like, it's on page 68. You can't turn on everything when you're landing on the moon or you overload the system. It was in the documentation that no one read. It's a super sweet story. But Like, where you're going matters. So I put a bunch of slides in here like this because I think this is something you guys could take away, and I'm sort of quickly running out of time here, but I like this idea of ideas, people, needs, choices, and learning. And if you think about it simply like that, you can line up whatever process stuff you want in here. And so if you line it up like that, you might do this. This is what I've been thinking about a lot. Like, over here is the land of iteration. That's Scrum Kanbanistan. And there's all the choices you need to make. So we use collaborative tools to answer like why you're doing it. Things like personas to say who are you doing it for. Story maps to say like, well, what's their experience like? And then this one, where are you going to start? What is your fundamental learning dimension? And when you do that, you start kind of saying, asking a difficult question, which is, if this is the land of discovery and this is the land of delivery, whether you have one or more teams, how much time are you going to spend here versus how much time are you going to spend here? That's a neat question. And you could use that investment language and say, how much time are you going to invest in raw discovery versus learning from delivery? So most of the Agile movement was to push the bar this way. Sometimes inappropriately, very inappropriately, when people say, you write all your stories in sprint 0. That's an arbitrary concept. That's a non-product-based, total process-based model that isn't even what sprint 0 was supposed to be about in the first place. It was a programming joke. It was a zero-based model where you got 0 points by trying to do a couple stories so you got your technical house in order. If you ask yourself that, you might say, we want to spend no more than 10% of our time in discovery. That's an investment-based choice. Then you say, how do you have Agile methods help you do that? And for us, that discovery looks like this. So this is a story map. If you guys want to know about it, you can go to my site. But it's really trying to say, what does that discussion look like? So this is sort of, we don't really do most of our backlogs. We never do backlogs, kind of how most people teach writing a backlog in a certified Scrum Master or certified Scrum Product Owner class, because writing a bunch of things and putting in a list and ordering them 1 through 100 is not how product thinking people work. That's how delivery people think about the world. It might accidentally work, but it's really shallow product thinking. As we typically say, what's someone trying to do, what does the high-level discussion look like, and then what are some variations? So affectionately called the map, where you're taking different paths through the map. That's what's going on here. This is who. These are examples. To use Dave Snowden's language, they start with simple and obvious, and they go towards complex. And you always end up with people in the meeting like this dude. He does not look happy. He's not like, yeah, let's discover. That sounds super fun. He's probably freaked out. Maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he's sitting there. Maybe he listens for a while. But we're going through, and this guy in the upper right-hand corner who's waving his hand, he's the product manager. So he knows the market. And if you want to know like who you want to have in the meeting, the people I would put in this discussion, I stole this directly from a guy named Marty Kagan. Marty draws this Venn diagram where he says valuable, usable, feasible. Way more interesting than a BA, a product owner, and all this role-based discussion. Rare that that's one person. Feasible is usually someone that knows the technology. Valuable might be a product owner. This guy is that valuable dude. This dude is who I would call a product-driven architect, and he's beginning to do what happens when people work together in a medium where they can collaborate. Usually a physical thing helps people collaborate. He's pointing at it. He's learning to tell the story. So the architect is doing product-driven architecture. He's thinking about how do you deal with the constraints of the system in the context of the people we're building it for, or what it's supposed to do. And this is the magic moment right here, when you get these two people pointing. And like in Cardboard, we're actually thinking about putting in a little someone is pointing feature. And I thought about it because it's a lot like the little ... when someone's texting. It's like, I'm collaborating with you. So this is possible to do in a distributed ecosystem. And they walk through, and look at what's happening. Look at how many people are up at the table, touching and building and moving and learning to tell the stories. That's what's missing when people just turn Agile and Scrum into let's get stuff done process. Assume delivery is a constant. This is the harder question. And this is not a team, this is a program. So they work for a while. At some point, usually someone asks me when we're done. I always jokingly kind of draw on a Monty Python reference and say, and there was much rejoicing. Then you got to go tell the story to a larger group. So Here's a little collaborative charter. Here's the story map, driven by some examples, product managers out there walking through these little user experiences. It's not quite this neat and tidy, but there's at least 3 teams. This is a program of 60 to 90 people just in the build space. And they're walking through, and at some point he runs and hits the wall of, I don't understand what you're asking me because you're talking about the constraints of the system, and I'm talking about the user experiences. And the architect dude gets up with one of the tech leads. So now you have a vehicle for feasible and valuable to connect. And that's what I think is missing, because feasible is sort of size. That's a dimension of feasible. Valuable is more ambiguous. And that's what I would probably leave you guys with, is like, that's what I'm on about, like visualizations. I'm going to ask you to think about this for my last question, which is, you queue up a story, you get it done, it's 6 points, and you find out it's wrong. Start tracking those as how many wrong points you had in a sprint. I dare you, right? That'll be a really interesting discussion. It'll ask you to start embracing uncertainty in a tactical level. If you're looking for more info, I tried to write a book once, and I sort of gave up because I'm too much of a hand waver. And I turned it into a series of videos, so you could go have a look at them. They're like an hour long. Sorry I ran over a few minutes. I'm super honored to be here. I hope you guys have an excellent conference. Thanks very much for listening.